The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the city of Warsaw on the night of January 15, 1943. In the suffocating darkness of a cramped apartment on the Aryan side, a girl no more than 12 years old pressed her back against a cold brick wall, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. Her name was Zofia, though that wasn't the name she was born with. Her real name had been buried along with her parents 6 months earlier, somewhere in the rubble of a bombed-out tenement she could no longer find. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small leather satchel against her chest. Inside were vials of morphine, bandages soaked in iodine, and precious doses of typhus vaccine, enough to save a dozen lives or to get her shot on sight if a German patrol stopped her. She had no weapons, no papers that could protect her, and no one waiting to ensure she made it home. But on the other side of the wall, beyond the checkpoints and the barbed wire and the soldiers with their dogs, children were dying. And Zofia had promised someone, she could barely remember who anymore, that she would not let them die alone. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Zofia had not always been alone. Before the war reached Warsaw, she lived in a modest apartment in the Jewish quarter with her mother, a seamstress, and her father, a bookbinder whose hands always smelled of glue and leather. She remembered the sound of her mother's sewing machine humming late into the night, the rhythmic clatter that lulled her to sleep. She remembered her father teaching her to read by tracing his finger along the spines of books he had repaired, whispering the titles like prayers. They were ordinary people with ordinary dreams. Her mother wanted to save enough money to buy a shop. Her father hoped to publish a small book of poetry he had been writing for years. Zofia herself had wanted to become a teacher. She loved school, loved the way words fit together like puzzle pieces, loved the smell of chalk and paper. But those dreams belonged to a different life, a life that ended the moment the soldiers came marching down Naluki Street in the autumn of 1939. The war did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one stripping away another layer of normalcy until there was nothing left but fear. First came the bombs, the screaming sirens, the night spent huddled in basements while the city shook above them. Then came the decrees. Jews could no longer own businesses, could no longer attend school, could no longer walk on certain streets. Zofia's father lost his workshop. Her mother's sewing machine was confiscated. They were forced to wear armbands with the Star of David, marking them as targets. And then, in November 1940, the walls went up. Brick by brick, the Germans sealed off the Jewish quarter, turning it into a prison. Zofia and her family were trapped inside what would become known as the Warsaw Ghetto, a place where 400,000 people were crammed into an area meant for 100,000, where hunger became a constant companion, where death walked openly in the streets. Zofia learned quickly that childhood ended in the ghetto. There were no more schools, no more games, no more innocence. Children became smugglers, traders, and thieves, not out of greed but out of desperation. They wriggled through sewers and crawled under fences, risking their lives to bring back a loaf of bread or a bag of potatoes. Zofia became one of them. She was small and fast, and her blonde hair, inherited from her mother's side, made her less conspicuous than other Jewish children. She learned to slip through cracks in the wall, to bribe guards with stolen cigarettes, to move through the city like a ghost. Her parents hated it, begged her to stop, but the alternative was starvation. By the spring of 1942, people were dying in the streets at a rate of 5,000 per month. Zofia had seen corpses piled on street corners, wrapped in newspaper, waiting for the morning carts. She had seen children her age lying motionless in doorways, their eyes still open. She could not stop. Stopping meant joining them. Then came the summer of 1942, and with it, the deportations. The Germans announced that the ghetto was being resettled, a word that sounded harmless but meant death. Every day, thousands of people were herded onto trains bound for Treblinka, a place from which no one returned. Zofia's parents were taken on a sweltering morning in July. She had gone out early to trade for food, and when she came back, the apartment was empty. A neighbor told her they had been rounded up in a street raid, forced onto a cattle car, gone. Zofia stood in the empty apartment for hours, unable to move, unable to cry. Everything they owned, the few books her father had kept, her mother's sewing kit, the blanket Zofia had slept with since she was a baby, was still there, but they were gone. She was 12 years old and she was utterly alone. She might have died then, swallowed by despair, if not for a woman named Irina. Irina Sendler was a social worker who had been smuggling food and medicine into the ghetto for months. using her official pass from the Epidemic Control Department to move freely between the Aryan and Jewish sides of the city. But Irina's real mission was far more dangerous. She was part of an underground network that smuggled Jewish children out of the ghetto, hiding them in orphanages and private homes on the Aryan side, giving them false identities and a chance to survive. Zofia had met Irina once before, when she had helped deliver a package of medicine to a makeshift clinic. Irina had looked at her with a strange mixture of pity and determination, and she had said something Zofia never forgot. "You are small, and you are brave. That makes you dangerous." After her parents were taken, Zofia found Irina again. She didn't ask to be smuggled out. She asked to help. Irina's network was composed mostly of women, mothers, nurses, teachers, social workers, who risked execution every day to save children. They worked in secret, using code words and hidden routes, moving like shadows through a city occupied by death. Zofia became a courier. She was given false papers identifying her as a Polish Catholic girl named Zofia Kowalska, and she was taught how to pass through checkpoints without attracting suspicion. Her job was simple but terrifying. She would carry medicine, documents, and sometimes money from the Aryan side into the ghetto, and she would guide children out, leading them through sewers and secret passages to safe houses, where they would be given new names and new lives. The penalty for helping a Jew was immediate execution, often on the spot. Zofia knew this. She had seen bodies hanging from lampposts with signs around their necks. This is what happens to those who help Jews. But she also knew that children were dying, and she had the chance to stop it. She was 12 years old, and she had already lost everything. Fear felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Her first mission was on a freezing night in December 1942. She was given a satchel containing vials of morphine and typhus vaccine, desperately needed in the ghetto's underground clinics. The checkpoints were heavily guarded, and the sewers, normally the safest route, were being monitored after a recent escape. Irina told her she would have to go through the main gate, disguised as a delivery girl bringing supplies to a German medical station just inside the ghetto wall. If the guards searched her bag, if they found the medicine, she would be shot. Zofia nodded. She didn't say she was terrified. She didn't say her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the satchel. She just took the bag, memorized the route, and walked into the night. The snow was falling hard and the streets were nearly empty. She walked past German soldiers smoking cigarettes on street corners, past checkpoints where dogs barked and guards shouted. She kept her head down, her footsteps steady, her breathing slow. When she reached the gate, a young soldier stopped her. He was maybe 19, with tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He asked her what was in the bag. Zofia's heart stopped. She looked him in the eye and lied. "Bandages and soap for the medical station, sir." He stared at her for a long moment, and she was certain he would search the bag, certain she was about to die. But then he waved her through. She walked past him on trembling legs, and she did not look back. Inside the ghetto, the world was a nightmare. The streets were filled with starving people, with beggars and corpses, and the smell of death. Zofia moved quickly, navigating by memory through the maze of alleys and ruined buildings. She delivered the medicine to a hidden clinic in a basement, where a doctor with hollow eyes and blood-stained hands took the vials without a word. Then she guided 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 8, back through the sewers to the Aryan side. The sewers were dark and freezing, filled with waist-deep water that smelled of waste and rot. The children were terrified, whimpering in the darkness, and Zofia had to carry the youngest boy on her back because he was too weak to walk. They crawled through the filth for what felt like hours, and twice they had to stop and hide, pressing themselves against the slimy walls because they heard German voices echoing above them. When they finally emerged on the Aryan side, Zofia led the children to a safe house where a woman was waiting to take them in. The children didn't say goodbye. They didn't say anything. They just stared at her with wide, haunted eyes, and then they were gone. Zofia made that journey more than 30 times over the next 6 months. She smuggled medicine, documents, and food into the ghetto, and she led children out, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in groups of 4 or 5. She learned to move in silence, to read the rhythms of the checkpoints, to sense when a guard was suspicious or distracted. She learned to hide vials of medicine in the false bottom of her satchel, to tape documents to her body under her clothes, to sedate infants with tranquilizers so they wouldn't cry and give her away. She learned to lie without hesitation, to meet the eyes of German soldiers and smile as if she had nothing to hide. And she learned to carry fear like a second skin, a weight she could never put down. The winter of 1942–1943 was the coldest in decades. Warsaw was a city of ice and death, where the Vistula River froze solid and the snow piled high in the streets. Inside the ghetto, people were burning furniture and books to stay warm, and the death toll climbed higher every day. Zofia's missions became more dangerous. The Germans had increased patrols, and the underground resistance, preparing for an uprising, was drawing more attention from the Gestapo. On one mission, Zofia was stopped at a checkpoint by an SS officer who demanded to search her bag. She had 6 vials of morphine hidden in a compartment beneath the bandages. If he found them, she was dead. She stood perfectly still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The officer opened the bag, pulled out a roll of bandages, examined it, then tossed it back. He looked at her with cold, empty eyes, and for a moment she thought he was going to search further, but then another soldier called to him, and he waved her through. Zofia walked away on legs that felt like water, and she vomited in an alley 3 blocks later. The historical context of Zofia's actions cannot be understated. By early 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto had become a death trap. Of the original 400,000 Jews imprisoned there, more than 300,000 had been murdered at Treblinka or had died of starvation and disease. The remaining 60,000 were living in the shadow of annihilation, knowing that the final deportations were coming. The underground resistance, led by the Jewish Combat Organization, was preparing for a desperate last stand. At the same time, on the Aryan side, a network of Polish civilians, many of them women, were risking everything to save as many lives as possible. Irina Sendler and her colleagues would eventually save over 2,500 children, smuggling them out in coffins, suitcases, ambulances, and through the sewers. They kept records of every child's real name, hidden in jars buried underground, hoping that someday they could reunite the children with surviving family members. Most of those families never survived. The women themselves lived in constant terror. Irina Sendler was eventually captured and tortured by the Gestapo, her legs and feet broken, but she never revealed the names of the children or her collaborators. She was sentenced to death, but was rescued at the last moment by the resistance. And all the while, children like Zofia, orphans with no official status, no protection, no names in history books, moved through the darkness, carrying medicine and hope on their backs. The turning point came on the night of April 18, 1943. Zofia was on her way back from the ghetto after delivering a package of medicine and guiding 2 children to safety. She was exhausted, her feet soaked from wading through the sewers, her hands numb from the cold. She emerged on the Aryan side just after curfew, and she knew she had to move quickly, but as she turned a corner onto a deserted street, she saw them. 2 German soldiers standing at the end of the block, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They hadn't seen her yet, but she had nowhere to hide. If she turned and ran, they would chase her. If she walked toward them, they would stop her. And if they searched her, they would find the false papers sewn into the lining of her coat, papers meant for another child's escape. She froze, her mind racing, and then she remembered something Irina had told her. If you have to choose between running and acting like you belong, always choose to belong. Zofia took a breath, forced her trembling legs to move, and walked toward the soldiers as if she had every right to be there. They stopped her halfway down the block. One of them, older and heavier, asked her what she was doing out after curfew. Zofia met his eyes and lied. She told him she had been visiting her sick grandmother, that she had lost track of time, that she was trying to get home before she got in trouble. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She was 12 years old, and she had become an expert in deception. The soldier studied her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding whether to believe her. Then the second soldier, younger and clearly bored, muttered something about letting her go. She was just a kid. The older soldier grunted, told her to get home, and waved her away. Zofia walked past them, every step an act of will, and she didn't run until she turned the corner and they were out of sight. She ran all the way to the safe house, and when she finally got inside, she collapsed on the floor and wept for the first time since her parents had been taken. The consequences of Zofia's work rippled far beyond the lives she directly saved. The children she guided to safety survived the war and grew up to have children of their own, carrying forward the lives that should have ended in the ghetto. The medicine she smuggled kept underground clinics running, allowing doctors to treat the wounded resistance fighters who would later rise up in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And her courage, the quiet, relentless courage of a 12-year-old girl who refused to stop even when stopping would have been easier, became part of the invisible web of resistance that held the Jewish community together in its darkest hour. She made her last mission in late April 1943, just days before the ghetto uprising began. After that, the routes became too dangerous, the Germans too vigilant. Irina told her she had done enough, that she had saved more lives than anyone could have asked. Zofia nodded, but she didn't feel like a hero. She felt empty. And then, like so many stories of forgotten courage, Zofia's story disappeared. When the war ended, the surviving members of Irina's network tried to piece together the names of everyone who had helped, but many of the records had been destroyed. Zofia's false identity papers made it difficult to trace her, and as a child, she had never been officially registered with the resistance. After the war, she lived quietly in a small town outside Warsaw, working as a seamstress, just like her mother. She never spoke about what she had done, partly because the memories were too painful, partly because she didn't think anyone would believe her, and partly because in the chaos of post-war Poland no one was asking. The communists who took power were more interested in rewriting history to fit their narrative than in honoring the complicated, messy reality of the resistance. Jewish survivors were often met with hostility, and those who had helped them were not celebrated. Zofia's story, like the stories of so many others, was buried beneath silence and shame. It wasn't until 2018, more than 70 years after the war, that Zofia's story was rediscovered. A historian researching Irina Sendler's network found a reference to a blonde courier girl in a coded letter from 1943. The letter mentioned a girl who had made more than 30 trips into the ghetto, who had never been caught, and who had disappeared after the uprising. The historian, driven by curiosity, began digging through archives, cross-referencing names and dates. Eventually, he found Zofia, or rather, he found the woman she had become. She was living in a nursing home in a small town, frail and nearly blind, but still sharp. When he asked her if she had been a courier during the war, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I was just a child. I did what anyone would have done." But of course that wasn't true. Most people didn't do what Zofia did. Most people couldn't. She had risked her life over and over again, with no promise of recognition or reward, driven only by the knowledge that children were dying, and she had the power to stop it. Her story was published in a small historical journal, and a few years later, a documentary filmmaker included her in a series about forgotten heroes of the Holocaust. But even now, Zofia remains largely unknown. There are no statues of her, no streets named in her honor. She never received a medal or an official commendation. When she died in 2021, her obituary in the local newspaper was 3 sentences long. It did not mention the war. It did not mention the children she saved. It simply said that she had been a seamstress, a quiet woman who kept to herself, and that she was survived by no one. But the children she saved, those who survived and had children of their own, carry her story forward, even if they don't know her name. They are teachers, doctors, artists, parents. They are alive because a 12-year-old girl with no weapons, no rank, and no protection decided that their lives mattered more than her own fear. They are alive because, in the darkest moment of history, a child chose courage over safety, compassion over self-preservation. And that perhaps is the legacy that matters most. Not the monuments or the medals, but the simple, undeniable fact that humanity survived not because of the soldiers or the generals or the politicians, but because of people like Zofia, who carried medicine through the sewers at night and asked for nothing in return. War, we are often told, is won by armies and strategy, by tanks and bombs and the grand movements of history. But history does not tell the whole truth. History forgets the children who smuggled medicine, the mothers who hid strangers, the ordinary people who became extraordinary not because they wanted to, but because the moment demanded it. Zofia's story is not unique. Across Europe, in every occupied country, there were others like her. Children and civilians who risked everything to save lives, whose names were never recorded, whose acts of courage were swallowed by the chaos of war. They were not heroes in the way we usually understand the word. They did not charge into battle or lead armies. They simply refused to let cruelty become normal. They simply chose, in the face of overwhelming darkness, to carry light. We live in a world that often feels overwhelming, where small acts seem meaningless against the weight of history. But Zofia's story reminds us that history is not made only by the powerful. It is made by the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones who act when no one is watching. It is made by a 12-year-old girl who carried medicine across enemy lines at night, who guided children through sewers, who lied to soldiers and risked execution not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Her story was lost for decades, buried beneath silence and the relentless march of time, but it was never truly gone. It lived in the lives she saved, in the children who grew up and had children of their own, in the quiet legacy of compassion that refuses to be extinguished. And now, when we remember her, we remember something essential. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That heroism is not measured in medals or monuments, but in the small, dangerous, necessary acts that save one life at a time, that even in the darkest moments, even when all seems lost, a single person, even a child, can make a difference. Zofia did not save the world. She did not end the war or defeat the Nazis, but she saved lives, dozens of them, maybe more. She carried hope through the darkness, one dangerous journey at a time. And in the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that we do not need to be powerful to be heroic. We only need to be brave enough to act when the moment calls. And the moment, whether we know it or not, is always calling.